As the police car rolled to a stop in front of his house, James took a deep breath. Two officers stepped out. One, a tall man with a stiff posture, glanced at Linda, then at James. The other, a woman with a calm but firm expression, rested a hand near her belt. "Sir, we got a report about a suspicious individual on this property," the male officer said, his tone neutral but cautious. James kept his hands visible, his phone still recording. "That's interesting," he said, "because this is my property, my house, my driveway." The female officer's gaze flickered to Linda. "Ma'am, do you know this man?" Linda hesitated, as if suddenly realizing how this might look. I didn't recognize him," she said quickly. "I was just trying to make sure everything was okay." James let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "And instead of just asking me, you called the police?" He turned toward the officers. "Since you're here, I have something to show you." He gestured toward the house, feeling a surge of confidence. A few weeks ago, while sorting through some old documents in the attic, he had come across something unexpected, something that connected his house to a much bigger story. It was a discovery that could change everything. The officers exchanged a glance. "What exactly are we talking about?" the female officer asked. James met her eyes. "I think it's better if I show you." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't necessary," she said quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding." James turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe for you," he said, "but I want to make sure there aren't any more misunderstandings in the future." The tension was thick, the moments stretched tight, and as James led the officers toward his house, one thing was clear: this story was far from over. James led the officers up the front steps, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. Linda lingered behind them, arms crossed, her expression shifting between frustration and unease. She had started this, but now she was in too deep to walk away. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The officers followed, their eyes scanning the space. It was a normal-looking home, neat, lived in, nothing suspicious. But James wasn't leading them to the living room or the kitchen. He turned toward the hallway, his steps deliberate. "I found something a few weeks ago," he said, glancing back at them. "Something that explains a lot." The officers exchanged another look. Linda was still hovering near the doorway, shifting from foot to foot like she wanted to leave but couldn't. James stopped in front of a door near the back of the house and reached for the knob. It creaked open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the basement. The air felt heavier down here, thick with dust and time. He flipped on the light, casting a yellow glow over the concrete walls. He walked over to an old cabinet tucked against the far wall. "This house has been in my family for a long time," he said. "My grandfather bought it decades ago. I always knew there was history here, but I never thought I'd find something like this." He crouched down, gripping the edges of the cabinet. With a firm pull, he slid it aside, revealing what had been hidden behind it for years. A small, metal door, bolted shut. It was old, rusted around the edges, and barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. The officers stepped closer. Even Linda, despite herself, took a few hesitant steps forward. "That was here when I moved in," James continued. "I never paid much attention to it. But when I found some old papers in the attic, I started digging, and what I found..." He exhaled, shaking his head. "It changed everything." The officers exchanged another glance. The male officer cleared his throat. "What's behind the door?" James looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "I was hoping you could help me find out." The air in the basement felt charged, thick with anticipation. No one spoke. The tension stretched tighter. Then, finally, the officer reached for his radio. "Sure, here's a gripping introduction for your YouTube video story." It was supposed to be just another quiet evening. James had just finished a long day at work, pulled into his driveway, and was about to head inside to unwind. But before he could even step out of his car, he noticed something strange. His neighbor, a woman he barely knew, standing at the edge of her yard, glaring at him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe she was just out for some fresh air. But then she pulled out her phone. Within moments, James heard the unmistakable sound of her voice, sharp and urgent, carrying across the street. She was calling 911. His stomach tightened as he realized what was happening. She was reporting him, accusing him of something. But what? He was literally in his own driveway at his own house. James sat in his car for a moment, disbelief washing over him. Was this really happening? He had lived in this neighborhood for years. He paid his mortgage, waved at neighbors, and minded his business. Yet here he was, watching this woman call the police on him as if he were a criminal. Then the situation took a turn. Instead of reacting with anger or fear, James made a decision, one that would change everything. He pulled out his phone, hit record, and calmly walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Is there a reason you're calling the police on me?" Her reaction was instant, flustered, defensive. She stammered something about how she didn't recognize him, how she thought he was trespassing. But James wasn't buying it. He knew what this was, and more importantly, he knew something she didn't. What happened next? Let's just say, when James started asking questions, the truth came out, and it was even more shocking than he expected. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what he found out. James kept his phone steady, recording every second. The woman, her name was Linda, he would later find out, shifted uncomfortably, still holding her phone to her ear. She was waiting for the police to arrive. Her face was tense, her eyes darting between James and his car, as if she was searching for a reason to justify her call. "I live here," James said again, his voice calm but firm. "This is my house. That's my car. Why are you calling the police on me?" Linda hesitated. "Well, I've never seen you here before," she muttered. "I just thought." "You thought what?" James interrupted, raising an eyebrow. He knew exactly what she thought, and the fact that she couldn't even say it out loud spoke volumes. The silence stretched between them. The longer she stood there, the more nervous she looked. Maybe she was realizing that she had made a mistake, or maybe she was realizing that James wasn't backing down. James sighed and glanced at the house. He had lived here for nearly 5 years. He remembered when he first moved in, how some of the neighbors were welcoming, while others barely acknowledged him. He never had any problems, never caused any trouble. Yet here he was, standing in his own driveway, being treated like he didn't belong. Just then, he noticed something. Linda's hands were trembling slightly as she held her phone. Was it fear, guilt, or was there something else she wasn't saying? "You know what's funny?" James said, tilting his head. "I've seen you around plenty of times. You walk your dog past my house every morning. You wave to my neighbor across the street. But you've never once looked in my direction until now. And suddenly, you think I'm a stranger." Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She took a step back, her fingers tightening around her phone. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she mumbled, almost as if she were convincing herself. James let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Safe from what?" he asked. "A man parking in his own driveway." Before she could answer, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. Linda's eyes flickered with something, relief, anxiety, maybe both. James, however, wasn't worried. In fact, he was ready. Because what Linda didn't know was that James had recently discovered something about his house, something shocking. And once the police arrived, he was about to make sure everyone knew the truth. The sirens grew louder, and James could already picture how this was going to play out. The police would pull up, step out, and immediately scan the situation. Would they see him as a homeowner defending himself, or as the person Linda clearly wanted them to believe he was? Linda was still clutching her phone, her face unreadable. Maybe she was second-guessing herself, or maybe she was just waiting for backup. James, on the other hand, wasn't nervous. He had nothing to hide. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he realized this situation might just work in his favor. "We might need backup," he murmured. Linda let out a sharp breath, her face pale. "This has nothing to do with me," she muttered. James turned to her, his eyes sharp. You sure about that? The basement felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The truth was right in front of them, and in just a few moments, they were all going to find out exactly what had been hidden in this house for so many years. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the officer's radio. James could feel the weight of every breath, every glance exchanged between them. Linda was still standing at the edge of the basement, gripping the railing like she wanted to bolt, but it was too late for that. The male officer stepped forward, running a hand over the rusted metal door. "It's been sealed for a long time," he muttered. "You said you found documents about this?" James nodded. "Yeah. Old property records, letters. Some of them didn't make sense at first, but then I started piecing things together. My grandfather never talked much about this house's history. I thought it was just a family home." He paused, his voice lowering. "But there's more to it." The female officer studied the door, then turned to James. "Do you have any idea what's inside?" James hesitated. "Not exactly. But I found something in the papers that suggested this house was used for something unofficial, something that might explain why this door was sealed in the first place." Linda scoffed, but it was forced, shaky. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're making it sound like some kind of conspiracy." James turned to her, his eyes sharp. "You seem awfully nervous for someone who thinks this is ridiculous." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the officer reached for his belt and pulled out a tool. With careful precision, he started working at the bolts, the sound of metal scraping against metal filling the basement. James swallowed hard. He had been waiting for this moment ever since he made the discovery, but now that it was happening, he felt the tension thickening around him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last bolt came loose. The officer stepped back, glancing at James. "You ready?" James nodded. Then, with a deep breath, he reached for the handle. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow passageway lined with crumbling brick walls. The air that seeped out was stale, carrying the scent of dust and something older, something forgotten. The female officer shone her flashlight into the space, her brow furrowing. "There's something back there," she said. James stepped forward, his pulse pounding. But just as he was about to cross the threshold, Linda suddenly moved. "Wait," she blurted, her voice sharp. Everyone turned to her. She was pale now, her fingers twisting together. Her whole body was tense, like she was struggling with something she couldn't keep inside anymore. James narrowed his eyes. "You know something, don't you?" She didn't answer right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't go in there," she said. "There are things you don't understand." The basement felt colder, the air heavier with something unspoken. The mystery wasn't just behind that door, it was standing right in front of them, and James was about to find out just how deep this went. James stared at Linda, his grip tightening on the edge of the door. The fear in her eyes wasn't just shock, it was something deeper, something that told him she had been keeping a secret for a long time. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their hands hovering near their belts, unsure of what was about to happen next. "What don't I understand?" James asked, his voice low. "What are you not telling me?" Linda swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together. "This house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's connected to something bigger. Something that people didn't want getting out." James felt a chill run through him, but he wasn't backing down now. He turned back to the dark passageway and stepped forward. The air was thick with dust, the walls lined with crumbling bricks. His footsteps echoed as he moved cautiously, the officers close behind him. Then he saw it. At the end of the passage, hidden beneath years of neglect, was an old wooden chest. It was heavy, the wood darkened with age. James hesitated for only a second before kneeling down and lifting the lid. Inside, there were stacks of old documents, yellowed with time. But as he shuffled through them, his breath caught. These weren't just any documents. They were legal records, property deeds, and, his heart pounded, correspondence between local officials and private landowners. He flipped through them quickly, piecing together what he was seeing. His grandfather's name was on several of the papers, so was Linda's last name. James looked up sharply. "Your family was involved in this," he said, his voice steady but laced with something darker. Linda's face was pale. "I didn't know the details," she said quickly. "I only found out recently. I didn't want this coming back to me." The female officer leaned over, scanning the papers. Her expression hardened. "These documents, these are old ownership transfers. There are names on here that shouldn't be. And look at this." She pulled out one letter, dated decades ago. It detailed a forced property sale under suspicious circumstances. James clenched his jaw. His grandfather had lost land that rightfully belonged to him. And Linda's family, they had been part of making it happen. "You called the police on me," James said, standing up slowly, "because you thought I'd never figure it out. You wanted me gone before I had the chance to find this." Linda didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was written all over her face. The officers stepped forward, gathering the papers, their radios crackling with activity. "We'll need to take this in for review," the male officer said. James exhaled, staring down at the open chest. He had come home that night, thinking he was just defending his right to be in his own driveway. Instead, he had uncovered a history that was never meant to be found. And as Linda backed away, her face stricken with regret, James knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. That ending delivers a strong emotional impact while wrapping up the story in a meaningful way. It leaves the audience with a powerful takeaway about justice, belonging, and the weight of history. Would you like to add a short reflection or message at the end to drive home the lesson for the audience? Something like, stories like this remind us why knowing our history matters. Sometimes the past holds answers we never expected. Or do you want to leave it open-ended?